It turns red when you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 2:31. I'd like to call to order this afternoon's Special Parks, Trails, and Recreation Committee to order. Before that, well, sorry, I'd like to acknowledge with respect that we are meeting on the Lekwungen, the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people. And we are honored to have the opportunity to build strong working relationships with the people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, whose historical relationship with the lands continue to this day. I'd just like to welcome everyone to the first Parks, Trails, and Recreation Committee meeting. And maybe everybody would like to introduce themselves to start off. Yeah. Maybe with Carol, go ahead. Oh.
Is this good?
Yep.
All right, great. I'm Carol Brown. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to be on the advisory committee and appreciative of Colwood having such a committee. I've been a resident of Colwood for 43 years. I presently, do you want us to say a little bit about
Sure.
what we do in Colwood? I'm a coordinator for Friends of Havenwood Park, and I'm also the chair of a volunteer group in Colwood, Citizens Environment Network in Colwood.
Thank you, Carol.
Hello, my name is Kimberly Doyle, and I have been a resident of Colwood for 1 year, about a little over 1 year, and actually just recently purchased this weekend and moved into our new home in on Grand Rose Terrace. So I'm very excited to be a part of. I've really enjoyed getting to know Colwood, and I'm really excited to be a part of everything that's coming and the way Colwood is growing. I am also a Friends of Havenwood Park member and a scenic member as well. So love the parks and trails here in Colwood and can't wait to see them flourish even more. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I'm Kim Torreson, counselor for the City of Colwood. Over to you, Misty. Oh, you gotta push the button.
My name is Misty Olson. I am a 10-year resident of Colwood. I am also a counselor with the City of Colwood, and I'm here today as the alternate to this committee. And I just wanted to be here to support Kim and to meet all of our new committee members.
And I'm Judy Knowles. I've been living in Colwood for over 30 years as well, and been involved with various of our parks, and I'm happy to be here.
Great, thank you, everybody. I guess next, maybe may I have a motion that the agenda of the Special Parks, Trails, and Recreation Committee meeting of June 12th be adopted as presented? Okay, moved by Misty. We don't need a seconder, is that right? Okay. Is there any discussion or anything you'd like added? And we can still add. I'd just like to add under new business 4.3 for like a roundtable discussion. Anybody else have anything else they'd like added or no? Okay, sorry. So everybody's in favor. I guess public participation. Is there anybody that would like to speak? No public participation? Cynthia? Oh gosh. That's okay.
Oh, there we go. I got red. Sorry, I think you had one more introduction to do. Did you want to do that before you go to me?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Um, maybe we'll just swing back to Chris if you just wanted to introduce yourself. That would be great. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
My name is Chris Shallow. I have been a resident of Colwood just for 6 months now, but Greater Victoria for 35 years. That's good.
Great. Okay, Sophia.
So the not very public. My name is Cynthia Day. I live at 3546 Charnley Place. I've been a counselor in Colwood for many years now. And I wanted to come, just happen to be particularly disabled at the moment, but one of my roles has been among many, including helping to create the covenant for Havenwood Park and many of the other parks that you'll be talking about. I know them fairly intimately because I've bushwhacked a lot of their borders. But I've also had the role of being an advocate for IAPD, which is the Intermunicipal Advisory Committee for People with Disabilities, which was created shortly after incorporation in Colwood to try to advocate for access and equality for people with disabilities. And about 10 years ago, we were very fortunate to be able to develop the user-friendly trail guide in cooperation with the CRD and Westshore Parks and Rec. And funding from the province, we've created the user-friendly art space at Esquimalt Lagoon. And we also, which looks like a picnic table. And the user-friendly trail guide, which has advocated to be able to go beyond the parking lot. Most accessibility improvements for parks end at an accessible parking space. So it's been my long-term goal to try to find and create more accessible parks. Colwood Creek Park is probably our most accessible park because it's the flattest. But I'm also hopeful that Havenwood Park could have an accessible loop, at least between where there's the trail that goes to the stairwell and the trail that goes the main trail to the rest of the park. If those two linked, then you would have a little loop where you could at least get away from the road, listen to the birds, see some things. And there is some signage that was a tool was created for signage so that at the entrance to every park, it shows you how far you go before there's a rest stop and what kind of the elevation is that you'll be attempting, so that for liability reasons, we're not declaring that you can do this trail because you have whatever mobility issues you may have at that moment, but you at least can know what you're up against and you can try it. And if it doesn't work out, you can turn around and go and try something else another time. But I wanted to advocate for having some goals and both identify how many parks and trails we have that are accessible, and then try to find some goals to reach, you know, as we're always trying to improve everything all the time. Hopefully our parks can quantify what we've got so that we know if we're getting better or worse, and make some goals for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Cynthia. Moving on to new business, 4.1, to review the Parks, Trails, Recreation Committee terms of reference. So I can go through it. I Don't know. I mean, has everybody had a read of it? Is there any changes or updates or that anybody has to suggest or? Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I can read through the just in case anybody doesn't have it, that sort of thing. For the purpose of the committee is to facilitate greater collaboration and exchange of ideas between council and the public, to provide advice and recommended policies on parks, trails, and recreation matters, including services, facilities, and specific community interests. The committee shall provide advice and make recommendations to council on the following: parks management plans, support and maintain the vision of Parks and Recreation Master Plan, provide a community perspective on parks, trails, services, and community programs, and foster public awareness, recognition, and support for parks, trails, and facilities. And the authority of the committee's function is advisory to council. The role is to review, comment, and make recommendations to council on issues referred to the committee by council. The committee has no continuing advocacy role concerning their findings and recommendations, and any initiatives proposed by the committee that have resource or financial implications, including staff time, require council approval. And then it just goes into the membership, and the committee is a 4-year term. And the staff, the resources and support are from a senior member of the Parks Department, senior member of the Public Works Department, a senior member of the Community Planning Department, and the Corporate Services Recording Secretary. The committee meets 4 times a year, on the first Monday of February, April, June, and October. And I guess there's one thing that I try to have in the terms of reference, and it's just a review that we do every term. So after 4 years, and then it picks up again. Maybe I could put a motion forward to have that added. So I'd like to make a motion to add an additional point that the terms of reference is to be reviewed during the committee's first meeting each term, so every 4 years. Is that? Dan, you don't have to get a second. Is there any discussion on that? Go ahead, Carol.
I think that makes sense. To review what has happened over the last 4 years with the objective of continuing what works and working on maybe other points that maybe need a little more clarification.
Okay. So is everybody all in favor of that motion? Yep. Okay, all in favor. Thank you. I guess we're already there. 4.2, Parks and Recreation Master Plan Overview of Mr. Borhill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start off by introducing myself and my colleague sitting next to me. So I'm Ian Burhill, Director of Community Planning. And today we've got an opportunity to go through our major document as it relates to Parks and Recreation Planning, our Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Joining with me today is our Manager of the Parks Department.
I am Gord Bavilier, Manager of the Parks Department, and I'm here in support of, here as a senior member of the Parks, but as per the Parks and Rec Master Plan, we support the community planning team through the process, and as well as are a big part of the implementation of all the recommendations and or things that come through the Parks Department.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Our lead consultant, Kate Evans, landscape architect with Lanark Consultants, could be given the floor. She's going to be leading our overview of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ian. And through the chair, I'm just going to share my screen here in a moment, and I'll begin. All right, so good afternoon. As Ian introduced, I'm Kate Evans, and I'm a park planner and landscape architect and principal with Lanark. And we've had the good fortune of supporting the city in various parks related projects over the past several years. Can everyone hear me just fine? Thumbs up. Great. So I'm pleased to be here to provide an overview of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, or PRMP, as I'll refer to make it a little bit shorter, and look forward to any questions or discussions you may have. So as far as an overview, I will begin with an introduction and an overview of the kind of nuts and bolts of purpose of the document, as well as the process, and I will touch on summary highlights from the existing system review. Then I'll kind of close out in the same order that the document is structured, with the recommendations and strategic actions and with the implementation overview. And then arriving at some next steps and any opportunity for questions or discussion. So in a very practical lens, because there's many ways to look at the purpose of the master plan, but in a very practical sense, it is to provide guidance for decision-making, management, annual planning, budgeting, and investment for parks and recreation in the city of Colwood over a 10-year horizon. So the plan is a strategic document that is system-wide in scope, and it is intended to be a living document that is reviewed and adjusted as opportunities arise and as relevant shifts occur in the community. So the document itself is structured in two overall parts, of which there are many subcategories. So the first, section A, front end of the document, is the supporting framework for the plan. And so it includes the vision and goals, existing conditions, the parks classification system, some quantitative analyses and benchmarks, as well as an overview of the engagement process, which was very central to the plan. And then secondly, is really the kind of key outcomes of the plan, the recommendations, strategic actions, and the implementation plan for these actions. Because engagement was so central to the development of the plan, I wanted to touch briefly on the overall process that supported the plan development. So this is the linear diagram that was used throughout the project and engagement, and it really is just a kind of visual summary of the three phases for the project. And the three kind of lines below it, the blue, the green, and the gray, illustrate that at each phase along the way, there was opportunity for feedback and involvement of the public, of council, as well as the project team and technical stakeholders. This diagram is just another way of looking at the process, and it really is just to kind of bring back the idea that what happened was we started at the big kind of broad idea gathering level, and we slowly worked our way in towards finalizing a refined and focused plan, and the importance of having that broad scope initially and involving community and council and others at that early stage, and then working together so that everyone was kind of going along the process so that we arrived at our kind of focused direction and our outcome. The vision statement for the plan describes a long-term future, and it builds on existing strengths and community values while simultaneously envisioning what the Parks and Recreation system could become for the future of Colwood. And it's supposed to be an aspirational take on both exhibiting what exists today and where the community wants to go. So the vision provides a reminder about the spirit and the intent of the system and helps to guide decisions about future changes and developments as they come up in order to make progress towards the community aim. So the vision is: residents enjoy a city that is green by nature and the privilege of a connected network of parks and trails within easy walking distance of home. Colwood's parks, recreation, and natural systems are unique to this place and integral to the community's identity and exceptional quality of life. The treasured public waterfront is iconic and balances resilience to climate change and sea level rise, respect for the environment, and a vibrant destination for activity and cultural events in the region. The diverse amenities and thoughtful distribution of Colwood's parks and recreation empower all ages and abilities to live a healthy lifestyle and provide a legacy for generations to come. So the vision is kind of that first level, and nested within that are what were identified and distilled from that process of starting out big and coming in, and the inputs from all of the different stakeholders and groups. We outlined 6 guiding principles that support the vision. So to celebrate our natural character, strengthen our connectivity, encourage our community health and wellness, protect and respect our environment, nurture our partnerships, and to enhance safety, accessibility, and inclusiveness. This information, in terms of the principles and the guiding vision, were developed not only with input, but also looking back to the OCP and other guiding documents that this plan relates to. So in terms of moving forward through the document and also through the presentation, I'll touch briefly on some of the existing conditions for the system. And since this was the city's first Parks and Recreation Master Plan, it was important to do a careful inventory and analysis of the existing conditions. And I know you're all very familiar with the city, and you all introduced yourselves and you're relative experts, so I'm not going to spend any time on general context, but the point that I will highlight here is the scope and subject matter of the PRMP. And the diagram here, the details are probably difficult to see, but the important point is that there are many contributors and interests that make up the overall parks and recreation system that is experienced by someone who lives or visits Colwood. So there's West Shore Parks and Recreation. There are school district lands, royal roads, national historic sites, etc. But while those areas are considered within the plan, the focus of the PRMP is on city or municipal parklands. And so those are the dark green areas, where those light green areas are areas that contribute to, but are not directly within the jurisdiction of the plan and actions that are outlined. So an important contribution at the kind of front end and framework for the plan is to establish the parks classification system. And that's the system that organizes the existing municipal parkland into the 7 categories that are shown here. So these classifications are tailored to the city of Colwood, and they're developed based on land use patterns, community needs, and suitable uses. Because the map images are quite small because of their orientation, I also just developed this slide as a bit of a snapshot and list summary of the city of Colwood's 50 or so parks and how they fall into the 7 classification categories. A couple of key notes here are that, in many cases, an existing park could fit into one or more of those categories. They're not mutually exclusive. And so in those cases, the park is slotted into the most appropriate category. So an example is the Coburg Peninsula or Esquimalt Lagoon. It undoubtedly provides community park functions, but it is firstly a waterfront park, which is really a kind of highlight or characteristic for the city, and so it's classified under that heading. The classification system, I guess the 2 most prominent uses are to assist in park management, and it does this by identifying the kinds of improvement and level of service that are suitable for each classification. So for example, suitable uses, level of accessibility, etc., in a nature park would be different and more limited than what is defined for a community park, which is intended to be very much more forward in its accessibility and its resources that are available. Another key use of the classification system is that it allows for tracking and comparison with standard metrics. So I'll kind of bridge into the next portion, which will circle back to this classification system in overviewing the quantitative analyses for the project. So there are a range of quantitative analyses used in parks and recreation planning. And for the Colwood PRMP, it explored the following 3 overall categories as the focus, and each has a couple of sub components. So first is parkland supply, and this is looking at the existing parkland that is available in the city. And so the sub kind of analyses that were done are looking at a population-based Parkland supply, which is looking at what the Parkland area is per 1,000 people population. So it frames it in a way where you can compare communities of different sizes. And the sub items to that are also an area-based supply, and that's based on the overall land area of the city and how much of each category of Parkland makes up of that, as well as the overall. And then the final and related item to those is carrying out those analyses and also carrying out the same ones for a selection of similar communities. And by doing so, you can have a comparison point to see, outside of isolation, how does Colwood position itself, or how do those figures compare to communities that have a similar relationship in area and focus and size, etc. The second item was Parkland distribution or access, and this is reviewing how Parkland is distributed in the city and in terms of walking time specifically. So this analysis was done both to kind of distance and walking time for access to parks and green space overall. So that was looking at not just municipal Parkland, but those are invisible boundaries essentially, but to any of the jurisdictions of Parkland, what was that time? And then the second item there was for playground space and what was the kind of distribution and access for that in the city. Lastly, the recreation facilities supply was analyzed, and this is looking specifically at facilities or things like outdoor sports fields, as well as indoor facilities like arenas, pools, etc. And this was completed both for Colwood as well as similar to the first example, community comparisons using the same list of communities. So before I share some of the details of the quantitative analysis, and not all of them, because we could probably talk for the rest of the afternoon on it, I just wanted to frame the role of this information and to clarify that it definitely has limitations in the context of parks and recreation planning, as well as a role. So in terms of limitations, this information presents as numbers and very much presents as black and white or concrete. But in actual fact, it's necessary to be reminded that there are many assumptions incorporated within each of the individual analyses. And so there are actually a lot of shades of gray, and the information is to be taken in consideration along with a range of other contributors, such as public input, etc., in order to make that information rounded and useful. For example, in each analysis in and of itself, considerations like quality are often not part of it. So we count how many tennis courts there are, but not how many are of high quality or are used often, those sorts of things. So it's a tool, but not the only tool to look at what the needs or gaps are within any one of the elements being explored. So due to some of these limitations, also location context is another. Some of the standards in terms of these analyses are standardized, and so it doesn't take into consideration what are the specific elements that are most important or relevant to Colwood as a community, which may not be the exact same as another community, even a similar sized one within the province. And so due to these limitations, it still is industry standard to do this work and to use it. But in BC and throughout much of Canada, the reliance on this information is much reduced, and that it plays a role, but it needs to be considered amongst other important components. And so the key opportunities of this information is really, as I said, to serve as a component within, it's an ingredient that goes together to make a cake, but in itself cannot produce a cake. And it provides a baseline for Colwood to track changes over time. That's perhaps one of the most important. So regardless what the quantitative numbers were, it allows the city, by using the same methodology as we go forward in reviewing the PRMP at the 5-year, 10-year annual mark, there is a more clear way to track metrics and understand what the system is doing over time. And by taking a standard approach, it does allow for community comparisons, which are always they are a useful component in being able to gauge how Colwood is tracking and responding to trends specific to this community, but also having a look at what's happening more broadly. So now that I've said my piece and kind of framed the grain of salt point of view of this information, I can kind of drill into a couple of details, which are very interesting. And if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to get into it. So the first one I'll touch on is the population-based Parkland supply. And so there's a lot of information or numbers on this table, and the ones that are kind of circled in yellow are the ones that I'll touch in on, just kind of the highlight points to pull from this. The first is that the City of Colwood's municipal parkland is really heavily characterized by nature park. So about half or almost half of the overall municipal parkland is nature park area. So those are predominantly Havenwood and Latoya Creek, just something to kind of note in that overall kind of review. And then as far as the next couple of components, similarly, Colwood has very substantial parklands from other jurisdictions. So 70 to 80% of the overall parkland within the city limits are under other jurisdictions, and about 20 to 30%, depending on how you consider the West Shore Parks and Recreation piece, are municipal parkland. And so circling back to one of my earlier discussions on scope, we consider all of the components, but the actions are specifically targeted on what the municipal system is looking to change and achieve, and acknowledging what is provided in the other systems, such as school sites and the federal and regional parklands, etc. The last point there is related to the figures under both the 2016, which was the current census data at the time that the review was done, as well as the projected population that was done as part of the Collier's report that is projected in 2038. And so in terms of municipal parkland, the existing condition at the time was about 5.3 hectares per 1,000 residents based on the current population. And the note there is just to acknowledge that if all of the parkland area in the city of Colwood stays the same and the population grows as it is projected to, then that ratio of population-based supply is going to go down because the population is going up and the parkland would stay the same. So really the note there, and I'll get into it a little bit further in the next slides, is just the need to both acquire and designate additional parklands as growth occurs. So the second item here is for community comparison. And so it's drawing forward some of those similar figures and numbers. The previous table was really getting all of the details out and helping to illustrate what are then grouped together as assumptions and numbers that are put into this table, which is looking at the same information that was compiled for a range of selected similar communities. So in this instance, it was prioritizing the communities that make up the West Shore, so Langford, View Royal, and Souk, and then also identifying 3 other communities which had reasonably available data, were of comparable kind of context or size, and had some similarities. So that was Courtenay and Summerland and Salmon Arm. And really the key findings here, again, I'll encourage you not to get too hung up in the precise numbers, but to kind of draw back and look at what can we draw from this. And it's really that the overall ratio of municipal parkland is fairly good. It's fairly close actually to what the sample average is at 5.3. The average is actually a bit lower than that at 5. But where we get into kind of some of the details and draw some things to carry forward in some of the strategic actions is that because there's such a dominance of nature parkland in the municipal system, the flip side of that is there's actually a lower kind of than ideal amount of active parkland, which is identified as community or neighborhood parks, things that have specific amenities and specific distribution associated with them. And so in moving forward to the recommendations and in other areas, the focus was, slightly increasing the municipal parkland ratio, and I'll explain why a little bit later, but then also focusing on the subset categories of parkland as priorities instead of just not simply overall, but there were a couple of more component gaps to fill that were more important within the classification systems. So for targets and future needs, again, this table is kind of the next step in illustrating a look at if we take the existing information and then we take the information that's available in terms of population forecasting, and we've established some targets that have some rationale within the master plan. What does this mean in terms of parkland area for the city moving forward? And the kind of boiled down takeaway is that it's the same that I illustrated a couple of slides ago, which is with population growth, we need to likewise acquire and dedicate parkland alongside that growth. And so the target here is about 5.5 hectares per 1,000 residents. The existing is 5.3. The slight increase there is mostly due to the fact that the population growth is planned to be denser than the current population in Colwood. And with more density, those residents will have less personal outdoor space, making the reliance on the municipal and outdoor public system of parks and recreation more important. And so the target ratio here is a little bit higher than what it is today in order to maintain a similar level of service to what is enjoyed today. And for community parks and neighborhood parks, that's where we see a little bit of a bigger difference in terms of the target being more significantly higher than the existing ratio. That's coming back to those are the kind of key points in terms of gaps within the system that are looking to be filled. The last column there is all of the numbers working its way to how many hectares then in order to achieve this ratio with the future anticipated growth, what kind of land area is being considered, and that's what the last column is. So about 56 hectares overall, and about the majority of that or half of it, well over half, is the community parks as well as neighborhood parks. And just to make sure that it's not an alarming concern, there's definitely work underway in this regard, and I'll summarize that on the next slide. So the efforts that are underway in terms of acquiring and dedicating parklands, there's kind of three key areas. For incoming parklands, these are for Latoria South and Royal Beach. And so this is very much a reflection that, with population growth, there needs to be parkland to support that. And these are numbers and figures that are well on their way to implementation. They're very far along in terms of discussion. The next item is kind of titled notional acquisition areas, which just means that these are areas that have been identified in the plan and other processes and conversations, but there's still several stages out from having a confirmed or dedicated area associated with them. And so the two areas of note there are the Allendale area as well as Quarry Park expansion, which is within Latoria South. And the last item here is quite a key one, and it will be one that will be of interest to the committee moving forward over the next few months, and that's for park improvement and acquisition bylaws. So there's two bylaws that are in process, and it's kind of a third complement or another tool that has come out of the recommendations of the master plan and has been advanced by staff in order to give more tools to help direct the kind of acquisition and improvements that will happen in order to grow the parkland and system in Colwood as we move forward. So that was kind of drilling down into some details. And mostly I wanted to give a little bit of context for anyone that explored the detail of that portion of the report. Just to kind of frame it a little bit, probably I'll close by reiterating the grain of salt, which is it can be very easy to get into the numbers and how are we going to get 30 more hectares? But I want to reassure the committee that the number of hectares identified for the target is less important than some of the details within the strategic actions, which frame what kind of improvement and where. So it is a component, but it's not, it doesn't need to be taken on its own. So the recommendations and strategic actions for the plan is kind of how we moved forward from all of the community inventory and analysis, the local trends and research, the comparison metrics and targets, and the community feedback. So the last item I described would fall into the community metrics and targets, but it's really, there's 4 broad categories, and all of those came together in a combined methodology in order to arrive at the context specific recommendations and strategic actions that are summarized in the document. And each of these components, if we took just one on their own, so just community feedback or just comparison metrics or just local trends, we would have arrived at a slightly different list of recommendations and maybe priorities or timelines within them. And so it's really the balancing out for each limitation. One of the other categories of our methodology helped to balance out that in order to arrive at something that was a little bit more balanced and tailored. So the recommendations are summarized into a couple of subcategories. And the first portion are community-wide in scope, and there are 18 identified. I won't read them all aloud, but they're kind of bigger picture items, I suppose. So the Beach to Mountain Trail Network is a good example to highlight or topics that occurred in more than one location, such as off-leash dog areas or youth amenities. And the second kind of sub-list that continues on from recommendation 18 and is recommendations 19 through 25 are location-specific recommendations. And so these are for not for every single park within the city, but for the ones that are more waterfront and community oriented or otherwise significant in land area, such as Havenwood Park. So for each of these recommendations, I'll go through, I'll just touch in on the format of it so that it kind of just lends an idea of how that information is outlined in the document and what the kind of hierarchy is. So initially there's a reference number, and this is done just because of the length of the document. It makes it easy to refer to throughout it, and it also relates to the key strategic actions which build on that same numbering system. There's also a description statement, just as the kind of 1 to 2 phrase summary of what's involved. But if you go to each item, there are details related to background and rationale, as well as planning and design considerations. So this is kind of where you can go for the most detail associated with each of the recommendations, or for some backfill information for why a strategic action is outlined. In a similar vein, in order to support the information, often there's images or diagrams that are used just to help illustrate intention that is outlined otherwise in written form. And then most importantly, are the strategic action tables. And so each of those has a few components as well. So it has a numbered action, and so it's a sub-numbering to the overall recommendation. So 7.2 or 7.3 or 7.4, when you see those come up in other areas of the document, those are all nested under recommendation C7. There's also a suggested timeline, and this is a result of the input that we received, as well as considering whether or not it's tied to any other steps that need to occur before it, as well as parties involved. And so this is recognizing there's both parties internal to the city as well as other jurisdictions for some of the recommendations. Preliminary budget, and this is used, again, not as a cost estimate for construction, but for budgeting purposes for staff and council and committee to use to inform recommendations. And lastly, key related recommendations. And this is just a reflection that as much as the overall content of the plan is organized into a set of recommendations, there are interconnections between it where the lines aren't absolutely separate. And so this just ties into what is related. So as an important complement to the capital recommendations, which is focused on more so on physical improvements or capital cost improvements, there's a separate list of policy recommendations, which is equally, if not more important, but they're not necessarily as physical in nature, and they apply to the entire parks and recreation system. So it includes things like P5, which is accessibility. And so this is something that is to be considered and incorporated in strategic actions and implementations throughout this plan, as well as in subsequent plans, such as the park management plans for individual parks like Havenwood Park. The last section of my presentation and of the document itself is on implementation. And although this is last in sequence, it is one of the most important sections in terms of resources for staff and for council and this committee. So the first item to note in the implementation plan is the funding strategies toolbox. And in summary, this outlines about 12 different strategies that can be used to fund the plan's strategic actions. And very similar to the structure of the policy recommendations or of the capital recommendations, you can go back to each of the numbered items to see the full detail of explaining of what that is or how it could be used. And in most cases, defining or considering multiple of these strategies is recommended in order to achieve desired outcomes for individual recommendations or strategic actions. And this is a nice kind of segue and continuation to the next slide, which is in chapter 6, the final chapter of the document. There are a series of strategic action plan summary tables, and these are organized by timeline and are kind of the short consolidated version that cuts out all of the detail that I just went through in terms of the structure of each individual recommendation. And it just condenses and kind of distills it down to the actions. And so there's an overall table as well as actions by short, immediate, short, medium, and ongoing. And these tables include the same information that is included back within each of the individual recommendations. So that's the reference number, the few sentences or phrases that outline the action, timeline, parties, capital estimate. But these tables also have an additional column, which is the suggested funding sources. And so as a couple of examples here, the first one, which is for a skate park, has suggested funding sources 1, 4, 6, 8, 9, and 10. And so those numbers correspond to the funding strategies toolbox. And as you can see, there's not necessarily just one pool of money that could potentially go to supporting that capital recommendation, but there's consideration for probably 6 that could be looked at, and a few of those combined and considered at the timing when it's appropriate. The second item there is an example just showing how these tables are also just color coded as another means of ease of demonstrating the timeline of the associated strategic actions that are summarized in each of the tables. And so really they're at the end of the document, and they're meant to be, everything before them in the document has kind of been considered, but these are the few pages that really for the people that are looking at this on a regular basis for annual and long-term planning, this is really a key resource to be able to refer to as a summary, and it has the coding in terms of reference numbering, et cetera, to allow you to drill back into some layers of detail when you want to backfill information and understand it further. So as kind of rounding out my presentation, I wanted to also check in on implementation progress. So the Parks and Recreation Master Plan was finalized and adopted in 2021. And since then, the city has been very proactive in going about carrying out some of the items that were identified as immediate actions. And some of the most important were to go through detailed park management plans for a list of parks that was highlighted in the overall PRMP. And so the ones that have been completed to date are for Ocean View Park, Lookout Lake Park, Colwood Creek Park, and most recently, Victoria Creek Park and Havenwood Park. And in terms of what is already in the works and upcoming and anticipated to be carried out and completed by next year are for Quarry Park, which is in Latoria South, as well as Herm Williams Park, which is identified as a community park and is very much central to the city, Outlook Park, and Meadow Park, which is more so in a category of review because it's been recently completed and developed as part of the development area there. But there are some management items in particular that are going to be reviewed and incorporated to flesh out what is done for some of the other park management plan processes. So to kind of tie things together a little bit and leave you at least with my initial overview of things, it's just to kind of further assurance that implementation has already begun, but one of the key next steps is likely that there's capital projects and overall recommendations from the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And within that, there's language that refers to when the park management plan details were completed to consider and incorporate those capital recommendations in the context of the overall recommendations for the system. And so from the previous slide, there was a list of 5 park management plans that have already been completed. And so an anticipated task moving forward will be to look at consolidating a look at how those park management plan recommendations fit within the overall system of recommendations and can be reviewed at annual budget reviews, et cetera, in terms of moving those things forward, both in the immediate and doing steps to contribute to some of the items that are longer term and will need efforts leading up to the final execution. So for the time being, I will end there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present a little bit of a a rapid fire. It's a long document, and so did my best to kind of touch in on the structure of it, some of the key highlights, how we arrived at the recommendations that are presented, and I welcome any questions or discussion.
Cynthia Day here again. Just I don't know, but as I was listening to the presentation, I feel like I'm missing the plan. So I'm just wondering if members of the committee have the plan in its entirety that they are able to look at, and I would assume that it's a living document and that there may be amendments over time, or that we would invite the committee to suggest refinements to the plan. But as you're describing your plan and what the headings mean and kind of how it's evaluated, I feel like I'm missing that I don't have the big document to look at. And I'm hoping that the committee has that, or is that maybe something that we need to catch up on?
Thanks for that, Cynthia. I actually found that a bit confusing too when I was going through the document, the agenda. There wasn't a link to the actual Parks and Master Plan, so I was concerned about that a little bit. And I guess from the presentation and the plan itself, I just have a couple of questions that might help clarify a few things. So my first question is regards to undeveloped parks and how that's listed. What does that exactly mean? Like, they're city parks, but we haven't developed them yet, or they have, like, why would we? I just don't understand that. Just probably because of my time on council, I don't understand. That's all.
Through the chair, I can do a first response there. I do hope that all committee members have a copy of the plan, and that would be a first and maybe the best item to contribute. I have the document myself open on screen, and I can share it. So for undeveloped park, there is a section, it's on page 41 of the actual document, that describes what an undeveloped park is. And so these are the areas that are currently dedicated as parkland, so they're officially dedicated as such within the municipal lands, but they have not been developed to provide identification or maintenance, or in some cases access, and in all cases amenities. So this is an area of land that exists, but besides seeing it on a map that it's officially designated, there's not a lot of other indication that it is a park. And so on that same page, there's an example for Drummond Park, which is a parcel of land that was dedicated, but there's not a sign anywhere that says this is Drummond Park. It's just a space where there's nothing. There's a space of land that there's nothing developed on at the end of a road. And so in a lot of cases, these are places that were dedicated as a part of development in the past, before the OCP and Parks and Recreation Master Plan existed, and there was less guidance for strategic parkland acquisition. And so there was a parcel according to what was required of the developer at the time, but there wasn't a requirement for improvements to be made, and there wasn't an overall strategy of how it would be connected. In some cases, these areas are natural areas that could not be developed, so they're a steep slope or something that should be otherwise designated as environmentally significant, but not necessarily usable for recreation use and access.
Okay, thank you for that. The other question I had was in regards to the plan itself, and at the back is where they list kind of how it rolls out to in timelines of what's happening for second, third type thing. I guess so when you say, like, for example, I don't know, Havenwood or Latoria, so we just reviewed those like that they're finalized. So they're finalized in terms of what the scope is, like what the plan is, but the actual plan isn't done yet, right? Like the signs aren't up to say that there's you have to have your dogs leashed and things like all that work hasn't been done, right? Is that my understanding?
Yeah, through the chair, that is correct. So both the Parks and Recreation Master Plan as well as the park management plans are both planning documents that include implementation plan information, but are not detailed designs and the implementation in and of themselves. So in each case, there are steps that need to be carried out and approved before the actual actions are on the ground. So, you know, it was a recommendation from the Parks and Recreation Master Plan to carry out park management plans for the list of parks, of which Havenwood and Latoria were the ones most recently. So that was the recommendation and the timeline. So that specific action has now been completed, and the completion is the plan, versus, you know, the building or construction of some of the things that are identified as capital recommendations in the overall PRMP or in the individual park management plans are items that will go to future stages of detailed design and budget estimating in more detail prior to budget approval and implementation.
Okay, thank you. Is anyone else? Oh, just push.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. May I call you Kate? Thank you for running through that. I am able, you know, I mean, we're able to get the full parks management plan online, but I must say that, you know, I do have a hard copy of the Havenwood Parks Management Plan, and that I find to be very useful to just be able to flip through and find what I'm looking for. So I would like to make a recommendation that the committee all receives a hard copy of the Parks Management Plan, because I think that would be quite useful as we go through the process, you know, for the next few years, to have an actual hard copy. I just find myself personally, it's just much more convenient. I have looked at it online, but it's just easier for me. Thank you.
Madam Chair. I just wanted to mention that staff's happy to accommodate any requests for hard copies of the Parks Management Plans or the Parks and Rec Master Plan. The Parks and Rec Master Plan is available on our website in several locations, most prominently the Parks and Trails website. Certainly would have been helpful to include that link on the agenda, so apologies for missing that. But we also have several hard copies available.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Kate or any comments? I have another question. I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask, I know this is kind of overall question, but in regards to accessible park washrooms to date, am I understanding that there's only currently the one at the lagoon in all of the parks, or is there more now?
As well as Meadows Park.
Meadows
has an
Park.
accessible
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, Sylvia.
I wanted to ask about the accessibility and the numbers, whether or not we are able to get some quantitative. I know it's kind of difficult, but there are, I mentioned that Colwood Creek Park is probably our most accessible park. Our most adaptive equipment is probably at Herm Williams Park. I believe that is still the case. It has been changing over time. Initially, that park was, there were a number of families in the immediate area who had children with specific needs. So that park became kind of a good place to put accessible play equipment in. So there were, at least as parks have developed in Colwood, some different focuses in different parks. I don't know if that helps you in your thinking about parks, but I am really hopeful that we could get some quantitative methodologies in, especially for accessible equipment or accessible trails or more user friendly. If that's, none of these things really fit with quantitative really well, but at the same time, um, I'm hopeful that we can develop our infrastructure to be more well matched to our population's needs. So we know that at any given time, 20 to 30% of our population has accessibility issues. So I would like to hope that 20% of our trails might be accessible, or some correlation of those numbers. And usually if we can measure it, it's less likely to be forgotten. Is that something that is possible to add to our park plan as we go along, or is the park plan already built in such a way that it can't be added at this stage?
Sorry, Kate, I guess that would be a question.
Sure, yes, I was just going to jump in through the chair. Councillor Day, I think it is a bit of both in that the structure of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan very much sets the stage for accessibility to be a component of each park management plan or each implementation action, so that that's a lens that is carried forward. And in the park management plans that we have done to date, there has always been a specific review, an opportunity, or an exploration. You know, sometimes there have been challenges to it, such as terrain in Latoya Creek Park or those sorts of things, but there's always been a recommendation, a couple of things specific to improving accessibility. The Parks and Recreation Master Plan is definitely identified as a living document and can be amended. However, I do think it currently is structured in such a way that supports exactly what you're speaking about. So for instance, recommendation C6 is for play amenities. And the first strategic action under that recommendation is development of a community destination inclusive playground in a central location. And, you know, the park management plan for Herm Williams Park is not yet done and targeted to be completed over the next year, but a related recommendation is Herm Williams, for instance. So I do think there isn't a final answer to some of the details, which are more detailed than the overall master plan is appropriate to address. But I do think that there's a framework within it that sets a path for how those details come to be realized. It's definitely kind of hard coded into the way the plan is structured so that those processes will continue to happen at the downstream actions and implementation.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could just jump in as well. So as Ms. Evans mentioned, there are specific recommendations relating to this area in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Recommendation P51, carry out audit or assessment of accessibility for existing parks and recreation facilities. Where possible, include this review as part of individual park management plans. So as Kate mentioned, we are undertaking that or implementing that recommendation through the individual parks management plans, as well as the waterfront stewardship plan, which is calling for some improvements specifically geared to improving accessibility at the waterfront. That being said, if there's specific parks that are not in the list for the individual parks management plans, staff could be directed by council to look at those specific areas and just highlight that as an option.
I'm sorry, thank you. In regards to, oh, sorry, Kimberly, just one second. Regards to that, I just wanted to ask, in terms of the wayfinding signage and that start that was, you know, with the user-friendly trail guides and stuff, is there, is there going to be a continuation? Like I realize there's funding required for that, but is there appetite to continue that process throughout the parks and have the signage at the front where it, you know, kind of marks the level of difficulty and that sort of thing for accessibility? Is that going to continue?
Madam Chair, I can take the, oh, sorry, Gordon, were you about to, I couldn't see you on the screen, so I was pausing. Okay, very much so. So in the park, the Parks and Recreation Master Plan does have recommendations specific to wayfinding, but then in part thanks to Councillor Day, the park management plans that have been completed to date have had further detail and recommendations in structuring both trail classification system as well as more detail for an overall parks signage system. So there is a system in part in place for signage, but there's recommendations in those plans about how to move forward, and they specifically reference the kind of imagery and the approach that is outlined in the guide that was developed 10 or more years ago, but that is very specifically included in the current park management plan documents and the latest information that was prepared on that. Gordon might have something else that he can share that's more specific.
Yeah, through the chair. I can just say, as far as the wayfinding strategy and how we're implementing that through the new trails in Royal Bay, we are going through that. There is an accessibility assessment being done through all those chairs through the developer and Gablecraft as we add those signs. And I believe that we're working through using the plan through all of to include the the accessibility of each trail and where it goes to and that sort of thing. And that includes as we work through that Cedar Mountain Trail, that's how we're kind of working through that right now with the implementation of that wayfinding strategy.
Thank you. Yeah, even I find those useful myself, just to kind of know what you're going into, right? So go ahead.
I'm glad to hear that the universal design is being looked at the start, because these types of things at the very beginning are so much easier to do when you're doing it at the forefront rather than trying to go back and retrofit. And we all know that, yes, those wayfinding signs are great for people with disabilities who need, have mobility challenges and need to know, but they're great for everyone. And so many of the accessible design and the universal, when you're designing for universal use, paved trails, they're not only good for people with disabilities, they're good for people with strollers who are out there and, trying to navigate these trails. Accessible washrooms, same thing. If you have a baby stroller and you need the extra room to be able to bring that into the space. So I think all of these, we look at them and we say they're for people with disabilities, but I think so many of these are really for everyone, and they make things better for all of us at different points. Whether or not the accessible paved trails are great when I'm on my bicycle. It's much easier to bike or to use a scooter or something on a paved trail rather than ones that are. So making sure that we, in addition to having all the trails that are not paved and the gravel trails, they're great as well, but making sure that we have all of these and at the forefront we do this so that we're not going and putting gravel trails down and then having to go back and redo it all and pave it to make it accessible, I think is important. So I'm glad to see that's being thought of at the beginning.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Oh.
I'm just glad to hear that the master plan is a living document, because changes will come along. Through reading through it, I did see C8 off-leash dog areas, but not a lot in the way of strategic action plans or implementation tables. But I am hopeful that that will come as through the living document, because I see that there is a need for off-leash dog areas, especially related to the amendment to the Havenwood Management Plan. I think this is something that we do need to consider in the short term for those people that desperately would like to have their dogs have that opportunity. But I think it's a very interesting document, and it really does provide us in Colwood with significant opportunities to begin the process of setting aside funds so that we can achieve some of these goals.
Great, thanks, Carol. Does anybody else have anything more on this? No. All right. I guess we can, so 4.3 roundtable discussion. I guess I just wanted to add this on so that it was an opportunity to give people like a point to add things that they're to the agenda, or suggest things or recommendations that they, maybe want to have put on the agenda going forward. So that was just and I know, Carol, that you sent in a few recommendations already. So yeah, so that's what this was for. If anybody has anything that they'd like to add or suggest going forward for discussion, I just kind of wanted to keep track of them. Yeah. Did you want to speak to what you've already put forward? Yep. Oh.
If that's appropriate. Okay, I do understand that this is a round table, and these are just discussion items, because I understand it needs to come through council as a direction to us before any action or any recommendations are made. But would you like me to discuss my 4 items briefly?
Maybe
I'm
just
more than happy to, but
yeah, maybe just list them. Like I think
with just a very brief
yeah, we have to go through
follow-up.
the process of getting them on an agenda, but just to give people an idea of topics that you've put forward. I have it right here if you need it.
Oh, I have it. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you. Yes, I'm a fan of hard copy, as you can see, just so I don't lose track of things. Yes, I had 4 discussion topics, and one was the establishment of additional park stewardship groups, such as the Friends of Havenwood Park. And in my submission to the corporate services, I just mentioned that there's a great deal of positive actions that come out of a stewardship group in a park. And after working in Havenwood for about 6 or 7 years under the direction of Gord with Parks and Habitat Acquisition Trust, just some great benefits from that. So that was one point. The second was we have mentioned here today the Beach to Mountain Trail Network system, and I just was promoting the idea of getting that started sooner rather than later, and possibly not waiting until all of the parks are created, because I know there's some wonderful plans for parks coming up, but it may be a significant amount of time until those parks are actually up and running. So I had suggested a phase 3 approach, where we even begin today with our existing parks and our existing trails and our existing roadways, with the idea that phase 2 would incorporate the new parks that are to come. And phase 3 would be a refinement and signage and all that would entail in completing the beach to mountain trail. But my point was, maybe we could get things started now and get our residents now involved. I have mapped out using existing parks and trails and roads and presented it to the city of what we might be able to do today. And I have walked it, and it takes 3.25 hours if you're not really pushing it. And we could call it the Colwood grind, because honestly, it's quite a challenge to go from beach to Lookout Lake. My third point was we have the opportunity on various occasions, I believe, to acquire trees and other plants for our parks through various funding opportunities that might or may not come our way. These various funding opportunities are sometimes local, sometimes provincial, sometimes maybe even federal. And if we could take advantage of them, it's so important that we support our Parks Department in providing staffing or funds to make sure those plants are watered, because if we either purchase or receive a number of plants, it's a strain on the existing watering of the Parks Department. And so we want to make sure that those trees survive and thrive. And so it might require additional funding to parks so that we can make sure. And with climate change, we want to encourage the planting of trees, the sequestration of carbon, and all the good things that go along with that. And I actually had 5 points. Sorry about this. And then, of course, land acquisition for additional parks. We've talked about that a fair bit. My 5th point was we may need to encourage amendments to the Colwood Animal Control Bylaw, which is rather limited in its scope as it stands today. Dog regulations 8.1 really only deal with West Shore Parks as far as being on leash, and the Esquimalt Bird Sanctuary, and within 10 meters of playground equipment. So we may need to just revisit that and deal with our park regulation, our dog regulation 8.1. So that's it. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to bring those to the round table.
Thank you, Carol. Does anyone else have? Oh. Judy.
Hi. Yeah, a couple of things that I would be interested in discussing over the course of times. The neighborhood groups and the or stewardship groups is something that I'm also excited about. And I understand that some of that depends on the formation of a volunteer, that the city needs to set up a volunteer way for people to volunteer. So that in the future, I'm hoping that can happen. The other thing that I would like to see kind of as an ongoing initiative is to do more native plantings in all of our parks, including, the more developed ones. And so I'd like to just discuss that as it comes up. Those are my big ideas.
Really?
Well, I'll third the volunteers thing, because I think there's a lot of people in the community who are willing to help with the parks. And if we can get the word out to more people to bring us together, it's a great way to have community, to come together, and hopefully also to maybe counteract some of what I've seen recently on walks is some vandalism of not just the fires that are recently, but the actual graffiti on some of the new benches and things like that, and graffiti along Murray's Pond area and stuff like that. So if there's a way for us to come together as a community in a positive way to address that.
Great, thank you. Anything else? No. Well, we are at the end of the meeting then. Can I get a motion for adjournment, please? Judy, thank you. All in favor? Great. Thank you, everybody.